Money isn't just paper and ink, and it certainly isn't just a number on a digital screen that fluctuates when you swipe a piece of plastic. In my years of doing this, I've learned that money is a language. It is a way that people communicate their fears, their insecurities, their needs for power, and more often than not, their deepest emotional voids. When someone tells me they are out of control with their spending, I don't just see a bank statement in the red, I see a person who is bleeding internally and trying to use a designer bandage to stop the flow. Today, I'm looking at a case that's as complex as any I've ever sat across from. Sitting in my dressing room before the camera started rolling, I looked at the files for a young woman named Sarah. Her family describes her as a runaway train, a person who has single-handedly dismantled their financial security for the sake of an aesthetic, for the sake of a feeling that lasts about as long as it takes to walk from the cash register to the parking lot. But I knew before I even stepped out onto that stage that there was more to this than just a love for luxury. When I first walked out and saw Sarah sitting there, she was the picture of composure. She was polished, she was manicured, and she was wearing enough high-end labels to pay for a modest mortgage. Beside her sat her husband, Mark, who looked like a man who hadn't slept in 3 years. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes were heavy with a mix of resentment and exhaustion, and he kept looking at the floor as if the answers were written in the carpet fibers. Then there were Sarah's parents, sitting on the end of the row, looking bewildered and defensive all at once. The tension was so thick you could have cut it with a knife, but Sarah sat there with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a mask, a very expensive mask, and my job was to figure out what was behind it. I've seen this movie before. I know that when a family reaches the point where they are willing to come on national television to air their dirty laundry, they aren't just looking for a budget plan. They are looking for a lifeline because they are drowning in a sea of debt and deceit. The central problem on the surface was simple. Sarah had spent over $200,000 in less than 18 months. This wasn't money they had sitting in a savings account. This was credit card debt, personal loans, and even a second mortgage that Mark claimed he didn't fully understand he was signing. She was labeled a shopaholic, a narcissist, and a spoiled brat by her own mother. Those are heavy labels to carry, and they create a narrative that makes it very easy to stay angry. But as I sat there, I wasn't interested in the labels. I was interested in the why. Why does a woman with a loving husband and 2 beautiful children feel the need to bankrupt her family for the sake of a closet full of clothes she hasn't even taken the tags off of? Sarah's defense was that she was building a brand. She claimed she was an influencer in the making and that in order to make money, you had to look like money. She spoke about it with a cold, calculated logic that sent a chill through the room. She wasn't just spending, she was investing in a version of herself that didn't actually exist yet. I looked at her and I asked her straight out, I said, "Sarah, what is it you're trying to buy that you don't think you already have?" She didn't have an answer for that. She just blinked and started talking about the algorithm and the necessity of high-end content. That's when I knew we had to go back. We had to dig into the soil where these seeds were first planted. You don't just wake up one day and decide to ruin your life with a credit card. There is a history there. I started asking about her childhood, about the dynamics in her home growing up. Her parents were quick to say they provided everything. They were proud of the fact that they never let her want for anything. And right there, that was the first red flag. When parents say they gave a child everything they wanted, it often means they failed to give them what they actually needed, a sense of boundaries, a sense of self-worth that isn't tied to material acquisition, and an understanding of the value of a dollar. Sarah grew up in a household where love was expressed through gifts. If she got a good grade, she got a new outfit. If she was sad, her father took her to the mall. They had inadvertently taught her that her emotions could be managed or even silenced with a transaction. She had become a world-class consumer of feelings. As we delved into her backstory, it became clear that Sarah felt like a ghost in her own life. She felt that without the gold jewelry, without the expensive handbags, and without the curated images on her social media, she was invisible. She wasn't just buying clothes, she was buying a personality. She was buying a seat at a table where she felt she didn't belong. Her parents sat there listening to this, and you could see the realization starting to dawn on them. They thought they were being generous, but they were actually equipping her with a very dangerous coping mechanism. The escalation of this behavior didn't happen in a vacuum. It grew as her life became more real. When she married Mark and had children, the pressure of adulthood, the pressure of being responsible for other lives began to weigh on her. Instead of leaning into her partner, she leaned into the mall. Every time a bill came due that she couldn't pay, or every time the kids were screaming and she felt overwhelmed, she would slip away to the computer or the boutiques. It was her escape hatch. Mark, for his part, had been an enabler for a long time. He wanted her to be happy. He didn't want to be the bad guy who said no. He told me he would see the packages arriving and he would just look the other way because he didn't want the confrontation. He didn't want to deal with the tears and the accusations that he was holding her back or suffocating her dream. By the time he finally stood up and said enough is enough, they were already in a hole so deep he couldn't see the light of day. The stories Mark told on that stage were heartbreaking. He talked about how he had been working 60 hours a week, taking every overtime shift available, thinking they were finally getting ahead, only to find out that Sarah had opened 3 new lines of credit in his name. The betrayal wasn't just about the money, it was about the secrecy. It was about the fact that the person he was supposed to be building a life with was effectively sabotaging it behind his back. Sarah sat there and tried to shift the blame. She said if he had been more present, if he had supported her career more, she wouldn't have had to do it this way. This is a classic move in the playbook of someone who isn't ready to take accountability. If you can make it someone else's fault, you don't have to look in the mirror. You don't have to face the fact that you are the one holding the shovel. I leaned in and I told her, I said, Sarah, you're not a victim of the algorithm, and you're not a victim of a husband who doesn't understand your vision. You are a woman who is addicted to the rush of the purchase because it's the only time you feel like you're in control. But look around you. You are losing everything that actually matters. You're losing your husband's trust, you're losing your children's future, and you're losing your own integrity. Is a designer bag really worth that? She started to cry then, but they weren't the poor me tears we'd seen earlier. They were the tears of someone who had finally been seen for who they really were, and it was terrifying. The confrontation wasn't just between me and her, or her and Mark. It was between Sarah and the reality she had been trying so hard to shop her way out of. We had to peel back the layers of the escalation from the small treat-yourself moments to the full-blown financial crisis that brought them to my stage. It was a journey through a landscape of broken promises and maxed-out limits, and we were only just getting started. I looked at Mark and I could see the physical toll this had taken on him. He wasn't just a husband who was angry about money. He was a man who felt like a stranger in his own home. He told me about the time he went to buy groceries for their kids and his card was declined. He had to stand there in front of a line of people, feeling the heat rise in his neck, while he called the bank only to find out the account had been drained that morning. Sarah had seen a limited edition collection and decided that their grocery money was better spent on a pair of shoes that she claimed would elevate her profile. When he confronted her, she didn't apologize. She told him he was being small-minded and that he didn't understand the investment she was making in their future. That is a dangerous level of delusion. When you start prioritizing the profile of your life over the actual substance of your life, you have lost the plot. I've seen this pattern 1,000 times. It's what I call lifestyle inflation fueled by an emotional deficit. Sarah wasn't just buying things, she was trying to curate a version of herself that felt bulletproof. If she looked perfect, if her house looked like a magazine spread, then maybe nobody would notice the chaos she felt inside. But the problem with using things to fill a hole in your soul is that the hole just keeps getting bigger and the things stay the same size. You need more of them more often just to feel the same baseline of, okay. We talked about the mechanics of her spending. This wasn't just a few trips to the mall. This was a sophisticated, multi-layered operation of deception. She had intercepted the mail for months so Mark wouldn't see the past due notices. She had created a fake email account to handle all the digital receipts. She had even gone so far as to forge his signature on a loan application. When I asked her about the forgery, the room went silent. Mark looked like he'd been punched in the gut. He knew things were bad, but he didn't know the extent of the legal jeopardy she had put him in. Sarah's response was chilling. She said, "I knew you wouldn't understand, so I just did what I had to do for us." That is what we call narcissistic justification. It's the idea that your needs and your vision are so paramount that the rules and the rights of others simply don't apply to you. I had to stop her right there. I told her, "Sarah, you didn't do that for us. You did that to him. You took his credit, his reputation, and his peace of mind, and you gambled it on a fantasy. You played Russian roulette with your family's stability, and you did it because you were bored and insecure." We moved the focus to the parents, who were sitting there looking like they wanted to disappear. I asked them why they had continued to bail her out. Every time she got into a corner, they would write a check. They thought they were being supportive, but I had to tell them the hard truth. They were co-conspirators in her destruction. When you shield someone from the consequences of their own actions, you are essentially telling them that their behavior is acceptable. You are robbed of the bottom that often serves as the only catalyst for real change. Her father, a hardworking man who had built his own business from nothing, looked at me with tears in his eyes and said he just wanted his daughter to be happy. I told him, happiness isn't something you can buy at a department store and give to her in a box. By bailing her out, you've kept her in a state of perpetual adolescence. She's a grown woman with children of her own, but she's still acting like a teenager who expects daddy to fix her mistakes. The escalation reached a fever pitch when Sarah's mother admitted that she had secretly given Sarah another $10,000 just last month after Mark had specifically asked her not to. The betrayal in that room was palpable. It wasn't just husband versus wife anymore. It was a total breakdown of the family unit. Mark looked at his mother-in-law and said, "You're helping her kill our marriage," and he was right. This is the hidden cost of spending addictions. It's not just the interest rates, it's the erosion of trust that acts like acid on the bonds of a family. Every time Sarah lied, every time her parents enabled her, and every time Mark looked the other way to avoid a fight, they were all contributing to the collapse of their foundation. I wanted to get into the psychology of the buy. I asked Sarah to describe the feeling she gets when she clicks complete purchase or when the cashier hands her that heavy, high-end shopping bag. Her face actually lit up for a second. She described it as a rush, a moment of pure clarity where she felt like she was exactly who she was supposed to be. But then, she admitted, as soon as she got into the car, the shame would set in. The buyer's high would vanish, replaced by a crushing weight of anxiety. To get rid of that anxiety, what did she do? She'd go to the next store. It's a closed loop. It's no different than a drug addict chasing the first high, only to find that they need more and more of the substance just to feel normal. We sat there and looked at the numbers. $200,000. That's a college fund. That's a retirement. That's the difference between a life of freedom and a life of indentured servitude to a credit card company. I had my team put together a visual representation of what she had bought. We had photos of the closet, the shoes, the useless gadgets, and the expensive dinners. Then we had a photo of their bank balance, negative $400. I made her look at those two images side by side. I said, Sarah, look at the brand you've built. It's a brand of debt, deceit, and desperation. Is this the influencer you want to be? Do you want to influence your children to live a life based on lies and glitter? She tried to deflect again, talking about manifesting success. I don't have much patience for people using spiritual buzzwords to justify predatory behavior. I told her, you can't manifest your way out of a hole you're still digging. You have to put down the shovel. I asked Mark what he wanted to happen. He didn't say he wanted the money back. He said he wanted his wife back. He wanted the woman he married before the labels became more important than the love. He was grieving a person who was still sitting right next to him. That's the tragedy of this kind of addiction. It hollows out the person and replaces them with a mannequin. As we moved toward the midpoint of our session, I could see the cracks in Sarah's armor starting to widen. The cool, collected influencer persona was starting to crumble. She was beginning to realize that she wasn't on a stage performing for her followers. She was in a crisis room fighting for her life. We had to go deeper into the why of the escalation. Why now? Why did it get so much worse in the last 2 years? It turned out that as Sarah's peers began to achieve real milestones, buying homes, getting promotions, Sarah felt left behind. Instead of doing the work to achieve those things, she used credit to pretend she already had them. It was a classic case of keeping up with the Joneses on steroids, powered by a social media feed that only shows the highlight reels of everyone else's lives. I told her, you're comparing your behind the scenes with everyone else's red carpet. It's a rigged game, and the only way to win is to stop playing. But Sarah wasn't ready to stop playing just yet. She still believed there was a way to shop her way out of this. She actually suggested that if she could just get one more loan to properly launch her brand, she could pay everyone back. The audacity of that statement left the audience gasping. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated addiction talking. It was the gambler saying they just need one more hand to win it all back. I had to be the one to tell her, the house always wins, Sarah, and right now, you're losing everything. The thing about an escalation is that it never stops until it hits a wall. It doesn't just taper off. It gathers momentum until the friction of reality finally catches up with the fantasy. As we sat there on that stage, I could feel that we were approaching that wall at 100 miles an hour. Sarah was still trying to negotiate. She was still trying to find a way to keep her brand alive while her actual life was in a pile of ashes at her feet. I looked at her and I said, Sarah, let's talk about the payoff. Because nobody does anything for nothing. You are destroying your life for a reason. What is the payoff? She tried to say it was about success or providing a better life, but I stopped her. I told her, don't give me the PR version, give me the truth. Is it the look on people's faces when you walk in with a bag they can't afford? Is it the feeling of power when you sign a name that isn't yours? She went quiet. The room was so still you could hear the hum of the studio lights. And then she whispered, it's the only time I feel like I'm enough. That was the moment. That was the crack in the foundation we had been looking for. This wasn't about shoes. This wasn't about Instagram. This was about a woman who felt so fundamentally inadequate that she had to buy a new identity every single day just to face the mirror. I told her, you're trying to solve an internal problem with an external solution, and the math on that will never work. You could buy every designer bag in Paris and you would still wake up tomorrow feeling like you aren't enough because you're trying to fill a bucket that has no bottom. I turned to Mark. I asked him, "How many times have you found a hidden stash of clothes?" He sighed and said it was a weekly occurrence. He'd find things stuffed under the spare bed, in the trunk of her car, even at her friend's house. Sarah had created a network of stashed items to hide the evidence of her spending. This is addict behavior, plain and simple. It's the same thing a closet alcoholic does with bottles or a gambler does with betting slips. It's the shame that drives the secrecy and the secrecy that fuels the shame. It's a toxic cycle that requires a massive amount of energy to maintain. I asked Sarah, "Aren't you tired? Aren't you just exhausted from the lies?" For the first time that day, she didn't have a comeback. She just nodded. And the tears started to flow, not the performative ones, but the heavy, soul-deep tears of a person who is finally admitting they are lost. I told her, the good news is you don't have to keep the lie alive anymore. The truth is out. Your husband knows. Your parents know. The world knows. The brand is dead, Sarah. And thank God for that, because it was a brand built on a graveyard of your family's dreams. But we weren't done with the confrontation yet. I had to turn my attention back to the parents. I asked them, what are you going to do when this show is over? Are you going to go back to writing checks? Her father looked at her, then looked at me, and he said, "I don't know how to stop. She's my baby." I told him, "You aren't treating her like a daughter. You're treating her like a charity case. And in doing so, you are robbing her of her dignity. You are telling her that you don't believe she is capable of standing on her own 2 feet. If you really love her, you will stop being her banker and start being her father." That means saying no. That means letting her feel the cold wind of her own choices. Because until she feels the consequences, she will never find the motivation to change. I then addressed the most painful part of this entire situation, the children. Sarah had 2 young kids at home who were being raised in a house where stuff was the highest priority. I asked Sarah, what are you teaching them? Are you teaching them that their value is determined by the label on their shirt? Are you teaching them that it's okay to lie to the people you love as long as you look good doing it? She looked like she'd been slapped. I've found that for many people, they can justify hurting themselves and they can even justify hurting their spouse. But when you hold up a mirror to what they are doing to their children, that's when the reality finally sinks in. I told her about the long-term effects on children who grow up in high-conflict, high-deceit homes. They grow up with attachment, anxiety. They never feel safe because they know the ground beneath them is always shifting. They learn that love is conditional and that honesty is optional. I said, "Sarah, do you want your daughter to grow up and find a man just like Mark, only to lie to him and ruin his life the way you've ruined his? Or do you want her to see a mother who had the courage to face her demons and rebuild her life from the ground up?" This was the breakthrough moment. The confrontation had stripped away the layers of denial, the influencer delusions, and the family enabling. We were down to the raw truth. Mark finally found his voice too. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. He just looked at her and said, "Sarah, I love you, but I can't live like this for one more day. I've already moved my things into the guest room. If you don't get help, real help, I'm taking the kids and I'm leaving. I won't let them go down with this ship." That was the ultimatum she needed. It wasn't a threat, it was a boundary. And for a woman who had spent her life ignoring boundaries, it was a wake-up call that she couldn't shop her way out of. I've learned over the years that people don't change until the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of changing. Sarah was finally at that point. She was standing at a crossroads. One path led back to the mall, back to the lies, and eventually to a lonely life where her only followers were the bill collectors. The other path was steep, it was rocky, and it was going to be incredibly painful, but it led back to her family. It led back to her husband's trust and her children's respect. I told her, Sarah, I'm going to offer you a way out, but it's not a check and it's not a loan. I'm offering you a professional intervention. I'm offering you a team of people who can help you unpack the why behind the buy. We're going to get you into intensive therapy to deal with this addiction. We're going to get you and Mark into marriage counseling to see if there is anything left to save. And we're going to get your parents into a support group for enablers so they can learn how to love you without destroying you. But here is the deal. If you lie once, if you buy one thing you don't need, if you hide one receipt, I'm done, we're all done. The weight of that moment was immense. You could see her processing it. The rush she usually got from a purchase was being replaced by a different kind of adrenaline, the adrenaline of survival. She looked at Mark, she looked at her parents, and then she looked at me. She didn't give a grand speech. She just said, I'll do it. I'm so tired of being this person. That's the starting line. It's not the finish line, not by a long shot, but you can't start the race until you're willing to admit you're in the wrong lane. We stayed on that stage for a long time after that, talking through the logistics. We talked about the credit cards being cut up right there in front of everyone. We talked about the brand accounts being deleted. It was a digital and financial exorcism. Every time the scissors snapped through another piece of plastic, you could see a little bit of the tension leave Mark's body. It was the first time in years he felt like he had a partner who was willing to get her hands dirty instead of just reaching for his wallet. But as I watched them, I knew the real work was yet to come. The confrontation on the show is just the beginning. The real test is what happens when the cameras go dark and the old urges come calling in the middle of the night. After we walked off that stage, the air in the hallway felt different. It was heavy, but it wasn't that toxic, suffocating heat of hidden secrets anymore. It was the weight of work. I walked with them back to the green room area, and I could see the shell-shocked look on Sarah's face. When the adrenaline of the show wears off, that's when the reality of the life sets in. I've seen it 1,000 times. The person realizes they can't go back to the hotel and hop on their phone to browse for a new outfit to soothe the sting of the day. They are officially in withdrawal. I sat down with them one last time before they headed to the airport, and I wanted to make sure the message really stuck. I told them, this isn't about a TV moment. This is about whether or not you're going to be a family a year from now. I looked at Sarah, and she looked smaller somehow. Without the armor of her brand, she was just a scared young woman who didn't know how to exist without a price tag attached to her. I told her, you're going to feel an emptiness for a while. You're going to feel like you're walking around naked because you don't have these things to hide behind. But that emptiness is exactly where the new Sarah has to be built. We talked about the biology of what she was going through. I explained to her that her brain had been hijacked. Every time she clicked buy, she was getting a massive hit of dopamine, the same chemical a cocaine addict gets when they take a hit. She had wired her brain to believe that survival depended on the transaction. Now, we were going to have to rewire it, and that is a slow, painful process. I turned to Mark, who was sitting in the corner of the room, still holding his head in his hands. I told him, you have to be the gatekeeper now, and that's a role you never wanted. You're going to have to be the one who checks the accounts, the one who monitors the mail, and the one who says no 12 times a day. It's going to feel like you're her parent instead of her husband, and that's going to kill the romance for a while. You have to be okay with that if you want to save the marriage. He looked at me and asked the question that every spouse in this position asks. How do I know she's not just telling me what I want to hear so she can get back to the credit cards? I told him the truth. You don't. Trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets. She's going to have to earn it back one drop at a time, and it might take years to fill that bucket back up. Then I had to have a very blunt conversation with the parents. They were already talking about maybe helping with the kids' school clothes or just covering the utility bill this one time. I had to stop them mid-sentence. I said, "You are already looking for ways to cheat. You are already looking for ways to bypass the boundaries we just set. If you do that, you are an enemy to her recovery. Every dollar you give her is a shovel you are handing her to dig her own grave." I made them look me in the eye and promise that they would redirect every single cent they were tempted to give her toward a trust fund for the children that Sarah couldn't touch, or toward the debt itself, paid directly to the creditors. No cash, no gifts, no exceptions. The first few weeks after the show were brutal. My team stayed in constant contact with them, and the reports coming back were exactly what I expected. Sarah went through a period of deep depression. When you take away the high of the shopping, the low of the underlying trauma comes rushing in like a flood. She had to face the fact that she was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Her husband barely spoke to her, and her influencer friends disappeared the second she stopped posting luxury content. She realized that the world she had built was made of glass, and it had shattered. She spent days in bed, unable to face the mountain of bills that Mark had finally laid out on the kitchen table. But this is where the outcome phase starts to take shape. It's not a straight line up, it's a jagged crawl. Sarah started seeing the specialists we provided, and they began to peel back the layers of her childhood. They discovered that her need for status was actually a response to a deep-seated feeling of being less than her more affluent cousins when she was a little girl. She had carried that not enough feeling for 20 years, and the only way she knew how to silence it was to look more successful than anyone else. Once she named the demon, she could start to fight it. She started going to Debtors Anonymous, sitting in circles with people who had lost houses, businesses, and families to the same urge. For the first time, she wasn't the pretty girl with the bags. She was just another person struggling to stay solvent. Mark, to his credit, didn't just sit back and wait for her to fix herself. He went to his own therapy. He had to deal with his savior complex. He had to realize that by protecting Sarah from the truth for all those years, he had been participating in the lie. He had to learn how to find his own voice and set hard boundaries without feeling guilty. There were nights where Sarah would cry and beg for just one thing to make her feel better, and Mark had to stand his ground and say no. Those were the hardest moments, but they were the most important. Every no was a brick in the new foundation of their relationship. The debt didn't go away, of course. $200,000 is a ghost that haunts a house for a long time. They had to sell their home. That was the bottom Sarah needed. Moving from a luxury suburban house into a cramped two-bedroom apartment was a public admission of her failure. She had to see her children packing up their toys because their mother had spent their future on things they didn't need. I think that was the day Sarah finally grew up. When she saw her daughter's face as they left that big house, the rush of the purchase was replaced by the sting of the reality. It was a bitter medicine, but it was the only thing that could cure her. I've always said that you can't change what you don't acknowledge. By losing the house, Sarah was finally acknowledging the total scope of her devastation. She took a job, a real job, working as a receptionist. It didn't pay much, and it certainly didn't fit her brand, but it was honest work. She told my producer that the first time she got a paycheck and used it to pay a utility bill, she felt a different kind of rush. It wasn't the manic high of a shopping spree. It was the quiet, steady heat of self-respect. It was the feeling of being a grown-up who was taking care of her business. It was a small victory, but in this game, small victories are the only ones that last. The parents had the hardest time. They had to watch their daughter struggle, and every instinct they had told them to fix it. There was one night where her father actually drove to their new apartment with a car full of groceries and a check for $5,000. He sat in the driveway for an hour, struggling with himself, but he remembered what I told him. He remembered that if he gave her that check, he was essentially telling her he didn't believe she could make it on her own. He started the car and drove away without going inside. He called me the next day, crying, saying it was the hardest thing he'd ever done. I told him it was the most loving thing he'd ever done. Looking back at Sarah's journey a year after she sat on my stage, I see a landscape that has been drastically altered, but the soil is finally healthy enough for something real to grow. Rebuilding a life after a financial and emotional earthquake isn't about the big gestures. It's about the quiet, grueling consistency of doing the right thing when no one is looking and there are no likes to be had. Sarah had to learn how to exist in the silence of her own life. She had to learn that her value wasn't tied to a grid of perfectly edited photos, but to the way she looked at her husband across the dinner table and the way she tucked her children into bed in a home they could actually afford. She eventually deleted her social media accounts entirely. That was a big step, and it wasn't easy. For weeks, she felt like she was disappearing, like she was a ghost in a world that only valued visibility. She told me later that the hardest part wasn't losing the followers, it was losing the distraction. When she didn't have a screen to hide behind, she was forced to look at herself in the mirror. She had to deal with the person she had become, the liar, the forger, the spendthrift. And that is where the real healing began. You have to face the mess you've made before you can start to clean it up. She stopped trying to curate her life and started actually living it. Mark and Sarah didn't have a fairy tale ending where everything was suddenly perfect. Real life doesn't work that way, and I'd be lying if I said it did. They had to go through months of grueling marriage counseling. There were nights of high tension where the old patterns tried to creep back in. Every time a bill came in the mail, there was a momentary flare of panic in Mark's eyes and a surge of shame in Sarah's heart. But they stayed in the chair. They did the work. Mark learned how to be a partner instead of a protector, and Sarah learned how to be an adult instead of an actress. They are still paying off that debt, and they will be for a long time. They live simply now. They don't go to fancy dinners, and Sarah's wardrobe consists of basic pieces that she bought with cash she earned herself. I checked in with them recently, and what struck me wasn't the clothes she was wearing or the car she was driving, which was a 10-year-old sedan, by the way, but the look in her eyes. The frantic, hungry look of a woman looking for her next hit was gone. In its place was a steady, grounded sense of peace. She told me that for the first time in her life, she felt solid. She wasn't floating on a cloud of credit and lies anymore. She was standing on the ground, even if that ground was a little bit rocky. She had found a sense of self-worth that couldn't be bought at a boutique or manifested through a filter. Her parents finally stepped back and let her be the woman she was meant to be. It was a hard lesson for them, too. They had to learn that love isn't a transaction and that support doesn't mean subsidizing. They started spending time with their grandchildren, doing things that didn't cost a dime, going to the park, playing board games, just being present. They realized that their daughter didn't need their money, she needed their respect. And she earned that respect by facing the consequences of her actions with her head held high. The central problem in this case was never really about money. It was about a woman who was trying to buy a sense of belonging because she didn't think she belonged in her own skin. It was about a family that used things to avoid the messy work of feeling. When we stripped away the labels and the debt, what was left was a group of people who just wanted to be seen and loved for who they were, not for what they had. I've seen thousands of people walk across my stage, but the ones who truly change are the ones who are willing to be honest with themselves when the lights go down. Sarah is a work in progress, and that's okay. We all are. But she's no longer a runaway train. She's a woman who knows her limits, who respects her family, and who understands that the most valuable things in life aren't things at all. They are the moments of connection, the truth told in love, and the integrity of a life lived with open hands instead of grasping ones. She's not an influencer anymore, but she is finally an influence, a positive one on her children. And in the end, that is a far better brand than anything you can find in a store. I'm proud of the work they've done, not because it was easy, but because it was hard and they did it anyway. That is how you change a life. You stop looking for the shortcut and start walking the long way home.